Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my belated 2019 Try a Story tag. I started doing the Try a Story tag a couple of years ago after Jen Campbell created it as a birthday tradition in July. I have a playlist with all of my short story videos down below. I also did an earlier video this month where I focused on a huge collection of Best American Short Stories as edited by John Updike. But this is a more traditional tag where I'm taking 5 different collections and reading one story per each and then deciding which collection I'm going to continue with. Except, I think I've already kind of made up my mind about which one I want to continue with. But the other 4 have been on my bookshelves for a while. And in fact, one of them is usually on the stack that this camera is on. And I have included all of them before in Try a Story videos. So I thought at the very least I could drag them out again this year and continue on my journey of slowly reading through them and give them a little publicity. So the first story I want to talk about is from the Vintage Book of Contemporary American Short Stories as edited by Tobias Wolff, and it is All the Way in Flagstaff, Arizona by Richard Bausch. This is a story about an alcoholic man. It actually starts at the end of the story. He's sort of reflecting on this one day when his marriage and family life really starts to fall apart, where he and his wife and his several children are on a picnic, and he's always sneaking back to a bottle of Jim Beam he has hidden in the trunk of his car. And at first he's clandestine about it, and he's like vociferously denying it to his wife what he's doing. But you know, as the story progresses, he gets more and more drunk, and so then he stops hiding it. So the story basically goes into his mentality and how he sees the situation as he grows more and more drunk. He's sort of trying to roughhouse and gallivant with his kids. There's also a little bit of tension with the kids and him, and personalities. A couple of them have a little bit of personality. Most of them are just kind of young. There's also a bit of roughhousing and fun times, which, you know, in the back of your head as it goes on and on, you think, you wonder if things are getting a little too rough and tumble, but he never sees it that way. In his head, it's always like about, you know, him really being able to open up with his kids, and it's only until the very end when they arrive home, and he thinks he's like, you know, just having fun with them, but then his wife tells him to, you know, get off of them, and he sees that they all have wide eyes and it looks sad, or like, so maybe he's starting to get a little too rough. And then it goes a little bit into therapy that he goes into is because his wife is threatening to leave him, and the therapy sort of touches upon some badness with his own father that is very vague, really. It doesn't really get into much of the specifics except that it was an abusive relationship. And from there, he's just not able to stay off the drink, and it ends with him alone. So it was an interesting little story. I think the most interesting thing about it, I guess, is playing with this point of view and this sort of unreliable narrator as it was about how he perceives things when he's drunk, even though nobody else perceives them to be that way. This is Great Short Stories by American Women, edited by Candace Ward, and I just read a Louisa May Alcott story. I think this is the first short story I've read by her. It's called Transcendental Wild Oats, and it's semi-autobiographical, which I guess is kind of her style. It takes place in one year of the 1840s, and she has a ragtag group of people go to the commune fruitlands. They're part of the Transcendental movement of that time period, which eschews money and capitalism, but also all sorts of harmful labor, like animal labor and slave labor and that sort of thing. So it's a really hard scrabble life in a way, because they're farming, but they aren't allowed to use manure, say, so none of their plants, or a few of them, come up. And they're also not supposed to use animals like cattle for any labor, but they find that it's just too difficult to do on their own. Like, she has a passage in here, like, you know, after a couple of days of breakback labor, the men do use some oxen, and even a cow that accidentally got mixed up in the oxen. Some of the parts of the story are kind of humorous, like with the oxen part, or there's a part where one of the women and children are desperately gathering up food that is being dispersed by a storm. There's very few women on this commune. And one of them is sort of as free-spirited as the men are supposed to be. Like, a lot of what they're supposed to do is just sort of pontificate and think all day, and one woman, and a lot of the men are just sort of poets and philosophers who don't do much else. But there are one or two women that basically do most of the domestic chores, and I do think that Alcott was lightly fictionalizing her mother, who followed her father into this life, and she wasn't so thrilled about that. But there's also a bit of sadness in this, I guess, about people trying to live up to their principles. They were also vegetarian, even like leaning vegan, and, you know, this whole idea of not using slave labor during slavery, or not wanting to hurt animals for food or other purposes. You know, there's a higher austerity to that, but Alcott points out that, you know, it doesn't work well in this world. It's not looked kindly upon by the rest of society, and people don't have the skills really to make life work and to survive, and by the winter most of them leave the commune. But in a way it's kind of a shame that people can't live up to their principles, which are made in good faith. But it's interesting. Summer Romances by Sholem Aleichem is the second story in his collection My First Love Affair and Other Stories. Aleichem was a Yiddish writer from about 100 years ago, most well known for writing the stories that led to the musical adaptation Fiddler on the Roof. But in other ways, he was a satirist. And in at least the first two stories, because I read the first one in another video, he crafts the town of Kozrelevke, a Jewish town in the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century. And the second story kind of goes off of the first story. It's a very lengthy, deliberately rambly and gossipy story where the author is always teasing and addressing the readers, and within it there are two romance stories with a lot of drama attached to them, and there's a whole lot of just commentary about life. It all takes place in the summer when the Jews of Kozrelevke have leave to rent villas or homes in a Gentile village where they're not really allowed to go otherwise, but there's the allure of going somewhere new in the summer. And so they kind of take over this new town, and the rich people go to one part and the poor people go to another, and they name these parts Israel and Palestine, sort of with the poor part being Israel and the rich part being Palestine, which seems to be some sort of commentary on the Jewish and non-Jewish worlds of the day. It certainly has interesting connotations given more modern history. And then they also go into some of the richer members of society, who they call the Kozrelevkes, Brodskys and Rothschilds, and Aleichem satirizes the way that they puff themselves up. It's just supposed to be somewhat a wild ride, and within it have some commentary, like the newspapers of the first story are back. There's an Orthodox one and a Reform sort of progressive one. The Orthodox one is called the skull caps for the kippah yarmulkes, and the Reform progressive one is the bowler hat for, you know, the popular style of the day. And there's another character who's a progressive in that he converts his wagon into a trolley that takes Jews from Kozrelevke to this villa town, as it were. So there's just a lot of kooky characters. I feel like at the end of it, like it's a long story, things were starting to go off the rails a little bit, and I'm like, okay, I get it, you know. There's too much humor, there's too many storylines and so forth, but it's a fun ride to take. And I guess I'd recommend it for Ashkenazi cultural commentary of the end of the 19th century. I'm inching over to the other side of the world in this one, kinda, with the anthology Oy Caramba, an anthology of Jewish stories from Latin America, edited by Ilan Stavans. And this is a much shorter story. It's only like 1.5, 2 pages. Anyway, it's in honor of Yom Kippur by Samuel Rollansky, who lived in Buenos Aires, although he was also born, I would assume, from the story in the Russian Empire as well. And the story really has very little to do with Buenos Aires, except that there's these two couples that only get together once a year on Yom Kippur, in part because they say the city's too big to traverse. But I guess there's some commentary in this as well, because Yom Kippur is the most holy fast day in the Jewish calendar, and these two men are anti-religious, and basically their entire conversation, as it were, are them drinking and eating, ending with a pig, which is also, you know, never kosher. So, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of cute, but it didn't really leave that much of a lasting effect, I don't think, as they were reminiscing about the old country and eating and saying, Happy Yom Kippur. I mean, sometimes I think to myself, I want shorter stories so I can get through them faster, but I think I should stay with something with more meat on the bones to stay with the metaphor of the story and food. Okay, finally I have The Pale of Settlement by Margot Singer. It's a collection, and I read the story Helicopter Days in here. It's mostly about these two cousins, one in Israel and one in America, Susan and Gavi, told from Susan's point of view. They're basically the same age. It starts when they're about 19, which is during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Gavi's a soldier in that, and Susan comes from New York every summer to visit her Israeli family, particularly her grandparents, who we get to know a little bit of, you know, their past about being immigrants, being, you know, thrown out of Europe, and their aging and all of that. But most of the story is about her relationship with Gavi for the next 9-ish years. That they obviously have a little bit of an attraction to one another, even though they really don't see each other, or, you know, a lot of it is based on their lack of communication with one another, because she can't speak Hebrew that well and he can't speak English that well, but they still have something going on. You know, they just have this thing even when Gavi has a girlfriend slash fiance slash wife, and he also has this weird group of friends that he sneaks away with everybody from, and they kind of, I don't know, have some sort of cultish thing going on with them. I don't know, I don't think it's the best story, especially since I already told myself I think I'm going to continue with this collection. And this one didn't blow me away as much as I think the first story that I read in this series of 5 did. I mean, that one was more intriguing to me. I liked it well enough, and I am ruminating over Susan's characterization. She didn't have much of one, but, you know, she was in school, and then she was a journalist, and then she broke up with a boyfriend, yada yada, and she was kind of goody-goody and hesitant, except with Gavi, who could kind of get her out of her shell a bit. Anyway, it made me think about how sometimes we write characters as authors, maybe when we identify with them too much. Like sometimes I think of my own female characters, protagonists, sometimes that they don't have enough personality, and they're, because mostly I'm in their heads too much, and a lot of Susan is about her thinking about Gavi, or thinking about her parents and her grandparents and all of that. I think there's an interesting thorough way, I guess, of alienation, which is something that always speaks to me, and sort of trying to make sense of family divisions, you know, living on different continents, having these experiences that take you apart yet pull you together, and trying to have connections with people, and how difficult it can be for some of us to, you know, feel connected to people, and how we have, you know, these shared experiences with family even when we don't see them very often. So I am hoping the rest of these stories are a little more interesting, and I am going to continue with this collection. You know, it's been on my Goodreads TBR for a while, and Margot Singer just wrote her first novel, which was in contention for the 2019 Sammy Rohr Prize, so that made me even more interested to read this collection. Some Jewish literary types online were, you know, touting it, and so I thought I should give her a try. She's definitely in my wheelhouse in terms of you know, this intercontinental Jewish family life as a setting, a backdrop. So there we go. So that about covers it for me now. Speaking of the Sammy Rohr Prize, I hope to be back here soon to do a video on 3 of the finalists, including the winner of this year's prize, the 3 books I read, to give my thoughts on them. Actually, none of them are the Margot Singer novels, so it makes me feel even more guilty, like I should at least read her short stories. I try to focus a little on short stories in July because I write them in July. It's my birthday month, and I want to keep that small niche of short story booktube alive over here, you know? We gotta give some love to the short story form. But I'll also have some novels and reviews and that sort of thing coming up too, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.